All right, guys, today we are going to be going through and talking about Athens versus Sparta and comparing and contrasting the two most famous city-states from ancient Greece, which did have a few things in common, but mostly were very, very different. So we're going to do kind of a side-by-side comparison and talk about different aspects of those two societies, one after the other. So starting first, we're going to talk about the focus of those societies or the main beliefs of people in Athens and people in Sparta in general. In Athens, the main focus was on education. Their goal was to produce educated citizens who were prepared to participate in the government and be involved in the arts. And a lesser focus, but still an important one, was that people were prepared for war and peacetime. So they wanted well-trained soldiers, but a lot of their focus was also on what people did during times of peace, running a good government, um, learning, reading, writing, debating, things like that. On the other hand, in Sparta, the goal was to have a perfect army for their civilization. And so the goal of their society and education in their society was to have a very disciplined set of well-trained soldiers who were completely loyal to Sparta no matter what. They had a very large focus on people having perfect bodies, being in perfect physical condition. And one of the main goals for that was so that they could be strong soldiers and so that they could also have healthy children who would grow up to be good soldiers for Sparta. They were so focused on people having healthy children that soldiers would come to the house after a baby was born to inspect the baby. If the baby was deemed not healthy and not fit enough, so if the baby was born with a physical deformity or if the baby was ill or sick in some way, the soldiers would remove the baby and throw it off the side of the mountain. And that was the end of the poor little baby. And that was how focused they were on creating good soldiers someday in Sparta. So not an easy place to be for sure. So let's shift gears and talk about government a little bit. In ancient Greek city-states, we've already talked about the fact that they transitioned through four major different types of government over the course of their civilization: monarchy, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. If you need a review on those, please see my video and notes on types of government. And also make sure that you have done your types of government assignment, please. Today, though, we're going to focus on the types of government that Athens and Sparta were most well known for, even though their governments transitioned a little bit over time. So continuing on from where we are, we're going to look at government in Athens first. I've done these slides by themselves instead of a side-by-side because it's just a little bit too much information to do side-by-side. So we'll talk about government in Athens. Athens is very important to us, especially in the US, because they are the people, the Athenians, are the people who invented democracy. We've already talked about this in class, but just as a quick review, we know that the word democracy comes from the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. So the idea is power to the people, because all of the people, or the people, were involved in the government. So in Athens, in democracy, they had a group which we'll refer to as the Senate, which proposed laws, and then the citizens voted on the laws. They had what we've talked about as a direct democracy. That was the first type of democracy, because all citizens could vote on all laws and decisions. Remember, citizens being the key word there. So that's great, right? All people could participate in politics. That's an amazing idea, except it's not true. All people could not participate in politics. They had to be citizens in order to do that. And there were some very serious restrictions on who was a citizen in ancient Athens. You had to be male, you had to be over 18, you had to be a landowner, and you had to be born in Athens. So you're taking out half of the population by excluding females from voting. You're taking out a younger chunk of the students, sorry guys, of the citizens of the population because they're not over 18. You're taking out the lower classes who are not landowners, and you are taking out people that have moved to Athens from other places. So you do have the idea of direct democracy. All citizens are able to be involved in all of the laws and decisions and debates in the government, but that group of citizens is much smaller than what we actually think of it as in modern times. So moving over to Sparta, Sparta is going to have what we have referred to as an oligarchy, where you have a powerful group of people that are in charge of the government instead of just one person or all of the people as in a democracy. So in Sparta, you had two kings who kind of co-commanded the armies, and they also had some religious duties. And then within that oligarchy, democracy was part of it as well. So you had a group called the five overseers, and this is the oligarchy part because they were five powerful leaders who, even though the kings commanded the armies and they had some other duties, these five overseers kind of ran the day-to-day operations of Sparta, made those day-to-day decisions, and they had the power to veto the groups called the council and the assembly. So the council or senate was a group of 28 men over 60 years old who proposed laws and acted as judges in trials. Then you also had the assembly. Now, the council or the senate would propose laws, meaning they would suggest laws and decisions, and then the assembly could vote on those decisions that the council was suggesting. The assembly was made up of all of the Spartan males over 30 years old. So again, we're seeing some citizen involvement in the government, but again, only males and only the older set. But really, if you take a look at it, think about who had the most power, because the council could suggest laws and make decisions as judges. The assembly could vote on those laws, but then the five overseers, those five powerful people, had the power to veto or overrule both the council and the assembly. So these guys here really had all the power because these guys could say what they wanted, but then they could decide whether or not to actually proceed with those decisions. All right, now shifting to where it gets interesting, I think, because it's kind of the most connection with where you guys are right now, is education. So first we're going to talk about education of boys in Athens versus Sparta, and then we'll go to grown men, and then we'll go to females as well. So in Athens, between the ages of 6 to 13, they would go to primary or elementary school where they would learn gymnastics and ball games. They would practice running, jumping, wrestling, discus and javelin throwing, and boxing. And if you think about these things, these are a lot of what we see in modern day Olympics, which are also going to start in ancient Greece. In addition to those physical activities, they learned singing, playing musical instruments, counting, reading, writing, but literature, so the studying of Greece's famous literature, was the most important part of their education. And they focused a lot on Homer, who we have talked about before. We know that Homer is responsible for the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we get the legends of the Trojan horse and Odysseus's trip home. And so students, as soon as they were able to, sorry about those notification sounds, just try and ignore those. As soon as they were able to, teachers would dictate or say out loud passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey to students, who would have to write it down, memorize it, and then perform it as a play. And that's the way that they studied literature and a combination of their history and their mythology and their legends in their culture. Now, jumping over to Sparta, education was very different for boys once they got to the age of 6. So instead of going to a primary school and learning those kinds of things that they did in Athens, at the age of 6, boys in Sparta would go to military school where they had to live. They were no longer allowed to live with their parents and families. They lived in the military barracks where they trained. They learned survival and fighting skills. They did also learn to read and write, but those were not seen as important as military skills. This military school and training was absolutely brutal. The boys were not fed well. They were told that if they were hungry, they should steal food, but they were not allowed to get caught stealing the food. If they were caught, they got beaten pretty brutally. They also had to march barefoot in order to make them tougher. There is a famous Spartan legend about a boy in training who tried to steal a fox to take back and kill as something to eat. But when he ran into some of the supervising soldiers, he hid the fox underneath his clothing, and allowed the fox to gnaw into his stomach, trying to get away rather than getting caught by the older soldiers as having stolen the fox. And the legend says that because he was such a tough Spartan soldier, the whole time the fox was biting into him, he never showed any signs of pain or weakness, so that he would not get caught trying to steal some food. All right, so let's talk about what happened when they get a bit older. So at the age of 13, in Athens, education changed for boys. They started what was called a secondary school. If you were in the poorer classes, then basically school was over for you at the age of 13. You would hopefully get an apprenticeship, which is kind of an internship where, you learn to build or forge weapons or make pottery or something. You're learning a trade skill, and the person trains you in exchange for letting you work there, but it's not a paid position. If you were in the wealthier classes, you would continue to study. You would choose a philosopher to study with in ancient Athens, and you would choose which philosopher based on what your goals were. So you either had the goal of learning just for the sake of learning, or you might have the specific goal of training to lead in politics. And so you would be learning especially about the art of debating and the laws and things like that. In Athens, nothing changed for you when you hit 13, because from 6 to 18, you were still in military school, becoming a powerful, scary Spartan warrior. So let's talk about grown men and what their lives were like in Athens and Sparta. At the age of 18, all Athenian men were required to complete 2 years of military training. So it's not that Athenians were only focused on academics and learning and achievements. They were focused on having a strong navy, especially, but it wasn't the major focus of their society. But all men were required to participate in the military and required to complete those 2 years so that later in life, if Greece did get into a war, if Athens did get into war, which they did often, then they had a good group of trained adult men who could go and fight for them whenever it was necessary. In Sparta, when you turned 18, you had completed your military training, and then you were eligible between 18 and 20. You had to take a set of very difficult tests that tested your fitness, your military skills, and your leadership skills. If you did not pass those tests, you became part of what was known as the middle class. You were allowed to own land and do business, but you were not a citizen, and you had no political rights, and you did not have the honor of being a Spartan soldier. If you passed, you became a full citizen with political rights, and you were a Spartan soldier, which came with a lot of honor and respect. So let's talk about how they spent their days and their lives as grown men in these city-states. In Athens, the men's lives were pretty relaxed, pretty good. They spent their time, a lot of it outside because the climate was so good. They spent their time in the agora, which was like an outdoor open marketplace, just talking politics and philosophy and debating each other and having conversations. They spent time exercising. They sometimes performed military duties or took part in festivals that were going on. They attended political meetings with the assembly. They were spending time voting or sitting on juries and making decisions. In Sparta, life was quite different, as you can probably already guess. They spent most of their lives with their fellow soldiers. They even lived and trained on the military base in the soldiers' barracks. They did not live in their own homes, even if they were married. They were allowed to visit their wives, but they did not live with their wives while they were still soldiers. And military service did not end until the age of 60. So the men basically spent all of their lives either in the army or at the army training base with those fellow soldiers. At the age of 60, they could retire, and then they were able to live at home with their families. But by that time, their children were probably already in military school. So let's switch gears and talk about girls' lives in ancient Greece, in Athens and Sparta, which were very, very different between those two city states. So in Athens, girls were not allowed to attend school. Many did learn to read and write because, like we said, education was important in that society. Not important enough to let them go to school, but it was important. So they learned to read and write at home. Um, but they mostly were trained to run the household. So cooking, weaving, cleaning, and managing the household slaves. And we'll get to slavery in a few minutes, but it was a big part of ancient Greek life, as it was in lots of other ancient civilizations that we have studied. Athenian girls were not given many rights, but in Sparta, things were very different. So at the age of 6, just like the boys, the girls went to military school. They lived and trained at the barracks. They learned things like wrestling, gymnastics, and combat skills. So even though they were not going to be full-fledged soldiers when they grew up, they were trained in how to be good soldiers because that was a good portion of Spartans' focus. And they also wanted them to be physically fit so that they could have healthy babies when they were adults. But girls had much more freedom in Sparta than in Athens. Same thing goes for adult women's lives. In Athens, women basically stayed at home, spinning, weaving, doing household chores. They were not allowed to be seen in public. Even if their husbands brought people to their homes for a dinner party or some kind of thing, the women were not allowed to be seen by the men that their husbands brought home for a visit. So they had to stay in another part of the house. They weren't playing hostess. The slaves would have brought the food in and taken care of the men at the party, bringing them drinks, bringing them food, things like that. But the wife would have had to be somewhere hidden in the house because they were not allowed to be seen in public. The only exceptions to that, women were sometimes allowed to go out in public to the theater. Greek plays were a really big part of culture there, and some religious festivals. But other than that, women had to stay at home and were not allowed in public. Much like young girls in Sparta, women's lives when they were adults, very different. At the age of 18, they also had their own skills and fitness tests to pass, just like the boys did. If they passed, and here's an important word, they were assigned a husband and allowed to live at home. They didn't choose their husband. They were assigned a husband and allowed to go live at home, no more military training. If they failed that skills and physical fitness test, they lost their rights as a citizen, and they would have been in that middle class like the men that failed the test that we talked about before. Women in Sparta had so much more freedom than women in Athens. So it was a harsh, dangerous place to live, but slightly more freedom if you were female. They were free to go out and about and see people and take care of the daily business of their daily lives because their husbands did not live at home. Their husbands were at the military barracks. So finally, let's talk about slavery and slaves' lives in ancient Athens and ancient Sparta. Athens had a huge population, as well as Sparta, actually. They estimate, there's no way to tell because they didn't keep detailed records about the slaves, but they estimate there were about 100,000 slaves in Athens at any given point. The slaves did a lot of different kinds of work. They did farm labor, working on growing the crops and harvesting the crops. The most dangerous job for them was to work in the mines, mining silver and other metals. The lifespan was pretty low on that because it was a dangerous job. They also assisted artisans. So they helped create pottery, constructing buildings and monuments, forging weapons. And they were also the backbone of Athenian households. They did a lot of cooking, serving, weaving, taking care of the children. Even the poorer classes in Athens would have had probably at least one slave helping them run their households. In Sparta, they had so in Athens, you might have been a slave if you had been a prisoner of war, you'd been captured possibly. Also, there was a slave trade where people would buy and sell slaves. And that was usually the result of pirates on one of the close by seas would capture people and then capture them into slavery. In Sparta, the Spartans had conquered a group of people called the Helots, and those were the biggest portion of their slaves in addition to prisoners of war. They farmed plots of land owned by the Spartans, so they took a lot of care of the agriculture there. Remember, the um, men were in military training, so their slaves did a lot of the agriculture work there. Part of the crops that they grew went to the Spartan family that owned the land, and then the rest would stay with the Helot and his family. So that is the end of our presentation. I'm sorry we couldn't do this session live like we had planned on. So if you have questions about anything that I said, you know, in class, you guys ask me a million questions, which I love as we're going through these presentations, and I do miss that. So if you've thought of questions while you were watching this, then please send them to me on email, on Hangout Chat, on Google Classroom, and I will be more than happy to tell you the answer or find out the answer for you if I don't know it. Because you guys do often help me realize the things that I still need to learn, and I miss that. So I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you're washing your hands, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.